Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Las Delicias natural processed Nicaragua from Drop Coffee Roasters. There's the container right there. And Drop, based out of Stockholm, Sweden, and this is part 13 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our second coffee from Drop in the Advent Calendar. And up to this point, I've had exclusively positive experiences with this roaster. This, however, will be the first true test, as this is a coffee that I typically wouldn't purchase for myself, as I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this variety, the origin and processing method combination, nor the flavor notes that they have listed for this coffee. So we will see how Drop does with a coffee that is traditionally not my preference. Again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and Drop does have a brew guide on their website, which is a 250 out, 15 in, or a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio. And they have 96 degrees Celsius, which works. That's what we've been brewing most of these coffees with, 205 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, always a little bit more difficult to tell with natural processed coffees, but this one definitely feels like it has a little bit more development than a lot of the other coffees we've had to this point. This one skews a little bit more on that light medium side of the spectrum. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. First impression, and the most important thing I was trying to detect from this coffee, and what I try to detect most with natural processed coffees in general off of a first impression, is just how clean is the cup. And to my surprise, the most distinct first impression I had was that it has slight grainy quality to it, which isn't necessarily uncommon for natural processed coffees. But the thing that followed after was a slight fermenty aspect. Definitely not near as heavy as I think I was initially expecting. That being said, it definitely did have a fair bit of fermentiness within the cup, but not in an overbearing sense. Additional aspects to the cup, there was a brightness that was felt quite early on, and that remained consistent throughout the time drinking this coffee. If anything, it actually did increase as the cup cooled down. But some other characteristics were the kind of darker berry aspect, which at this point I describe as, well, just kind of a characteristic of natural processed coffees in general. They have a rum raisin note listed on here, and I would say that that's probably in line with this darker berry aspect that I am experiencing. In addition to that, the bright citric aspect that I had mentioned earlier, and a heavier chocolate component, so pretty in line with what I traditionally get from a lot more of the modern natural processed coffees, all of which were in a more heavy vibrancy. However, the cup did improve a fair bit as it had cooled down, and I was able to pick out a lot more of those kind of tropical citric notes, a little bit more sweetness from those as well. And in terms of the Chemex does seem to clear this coffee up ever so slightly. This coffee does remain fermenty throughout the entire time drinking it. But one thing the Chemex seems to do is maybe strip away some of the more nice fruit aspects to this coffee. And while it does clean up the booziness within the cup itself, it just still accentuates that, given that a lot of the other characteristics feel even more toned down. So I'm not necessarily sure which brew method I prefer, but neither of them really seemed to do what I felt this coffee was capable of doing. But in addition to that, the cup just continued to improve as it had continued to cool down. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, a couple of level 5, correction, a couple of level 4s, we have 5 of them. So let's start with the finish at level 4. That's actually off to a good start, because typically when it comes to natural processed coffees, anaerobic natural processed coffees, they've reached that level 5 mark for being overbearing. And one of the first things I mentioned about this coffee was that it wasn't overbearing. So while it is a little bit more heavy, it is a little bit more fermenty, it's not to the point where it justified that level 5 mark. So that's actually off to a good start. Acidity, level 4. Yeah, I think that kind of took me by surprise a little bit, because this coffee was bright throughout, right from the first impression all the way to the end. Regardless of which brew method, the acidity remained very bright in this coffee, so I definitely see that there at that level 4 mark. Berry fruit, level 4. And again, I think the rum raisin note that they had listed on here was more of a nondescript fermenting berry for me. And that's where it reached that level 4 mark. I think the best way I describe it is what modern natural processed coffee berry tastes like. And then the citrus fruit at a level 4, that's going to be the best part of this coffee for me, especially as it does cool down. It seems to open up some more complexity within the citric aspects themselves. So I think that they had some citric flavor note. I should really look that one up, but I believe that there was a citric flavor note that they had listed on here, and I could say that it was a slightly wide array of just tropical fruits in general that skewed a little bit more on the citric side of things. And while we're on that topic, I did want to mention briefly that the stone fruit really did open up as it had cooled down. So while it's a 2 on this tasting wheel, I would actually bump that up to a 3 as the cup does continue to cool down. Other level 4 we have is the chocolate, and yes, that came out in a more heavy chocolate sense, and that's been another aspect that's been very common in a lot of natural processed coffees. So heavier on the chocolate, heavier on the berry, and just heavier on the cup in general. So that right there belongs at a level 4 for me, probably the 3rd most dominant characteristic in this coffee. And then some level 3s, we'll start with the body at a level 3. Yes, again, one of those things when it comes to Chemex versus V60, slightly less body in the Chemex, but even then I think it's at a level 3 regardless. Saltiness, level 3. That one was a little bit of a surprise to me, but this coffee does feel salty regardless of which brew method it's run through. So that right there is just kind of interesting in general. It might be attributed to it being a Central American coffee. And then sweetness at a level 3. I was honestly expecting this coffee to be a little bit more sweet. And when you are sacrificing clarity, I would expect that it would be at the cost of sweetness. It meant that you would get a lot more sweetness from this cup. This coffee didn't really seem to have either of those at the type of level I would really like from a coffee, but the sweetness remained, for the most part, slightly more moderate than I was expecting. Maybe you're on the higher side of the 3, but if I did push it to a level 4, it's not necessarily a type of sweetness that I am enjoying. And then the last thing we must discuss, the cleanliness at level 2. It's actually not that bad when you think about it, because so many of these coffees have reached that level 1 mark. This one does have more clarity than a lot more of the heavier processed natural processed coffees or the anaerobic coffees. So by that standard, it's doing well, being at that level 2 mark. I think that this made this coffee a lot more palatable than a lot of the other coffees I've had in this similar type. So there at that level 2, I agree with that. I wouldn't put it any higher than that though. It's definitely a fair bit of a fermenty cup of coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I went into this one not necessarily thinking that this was going to be my favorite, and it wasn't. There were some highlights to it. I did feel that some of the tropical sweetness was quite nice, and at the same time, it wasn't quite as heavy as I was expecting. And those are kind of the best takeaways I could have from this coffee, because I mentioned in the most previous review that I think I'm not able to pick out a lot more of the complexity in the flavors when the cup is a little too heavy and overbearing in a certain direction. And while this one didn't cross that threshold of being too overbearing, it still, at the same vein, was a little bit more overbearing than I like for a coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you've really enjoyed the natural processed coffees while at the same time looking for maybe a slight bit more clarity. This one right here provides a little bit closer of a balance on that, because it doesn't necessarily take away a lot more of the vibrant, heavier aspects, while at the same time it just does provide a slight bit more clarity, so it's not as overbearing, it's not as heavy as some of the more just really overly heavy coffees have been. That's kind of the best way I can point this coffee, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this one, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Las Delicias natural processed Nicaragua from Drop Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.